The Lord had given to Israel a king of the kind they wanted, a king like the other nations, a person who was impressive on the outside, tall and strong and handsome, intelligent, from an important family, a rich family. And although the Spirit of the Lord came with him to help him, yet he became proud as he became successful. He thought his success was because of his greatness, rather than acknowledging that his success was because of his obedience to the Lord. It was the Lord who would give him success. The Lord had sent him on a mission to destroy the Amalekites. This was a judgment on the Amalekites because they had consistently and persistently resisted God's plan for Israel. And because this was a judgment, Israel was not to benefit or profit at all from destroying them. Everything that was associated with them was to be destroyed. But the people, obviously with Saul's blessing, took livestock and other valuable possessions. They only destroyed the worthless stuff. And Saul kept the king of the Amalekites, Agag, alive. He was a king after all. No, the Lord had said destroy the lot. So while Saul was building a monument to himself, the Lord was distressed that Saul had disobeyed. God would choose a man after his own heart, a man who would not be corrupted by power and glorify himself, a man who loved God deeply, which was something that Saul evidently did not have, and sent Samuel to anoint David, the youngest son of Jesse from Bethlehem, who was a shepherd, but having heard of the God of Israel, when he spent time with the sheep, he looked at the stars and saw the glory of God. He looked at the sheep and realized that God was his shepherd, and developed a very strong devotional life, singing praises to the Lord. But along with that, he was brave and strong and handsome, although not tall. God had seen David out on the hills and wanted him to be the new king. And so he sent Samuel to anoint David and gave David the Holy Spirit, taking it from Saul and sending instead to Saul a distressing spirit, a spirit of melancholy, a spirit of depression. And Saul's servants, when they saw the state that Saul was getting into, suggested he get a musician. And one of them knew of David, a skilled musician. And so David was appointed to Saul's court, formerly as an armour-bearer, but to sing and to play the harp before him, to calm him when he got agitated and distressed. But the Philistines continue to harass the Israelites, and from time to time Saul must go and fight them. And so we continue reading in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. And they encamped between Socoh and Azekah, in Ephes Danim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they camped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armour on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff in his hand was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield-bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel, and said to them, Why have you come out to line up in battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants, and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons. The man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. And the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son David, Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain, and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight, and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then, as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Then David spoke to the men who stood by, saying, What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine, and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, So shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his older brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was roused against David. And he said, Why did you come here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another, and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. And when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight the Philistine. But our time's gone. You'll have to join me again to find out what happened. The giants had been in the country from before the Israelites had come in. The Israelites were instructed to destroy all the residents of the land, and while they had defeated the giants who were at Hebron, they had not defeated the giants who were around Ashkelon and Gaza. And so this family of giants had persisted, and they were adopted by the Philistines, who settled in that area, which should have been Israelite territory. And Saul's army still stands cowed before this man.